Hi everyone, this is Maddie, one of the naturalists at Gulf Branch Nature Center. Thanks again for joining me for another walk around my block where we take a walk around my neighborhood and look for something cool that's happening at this time of year that's probably also happening in your neighborhood as well. As things start to open back up again and we're no longer limited to just our neighborhoods, we'll probably be rolling back our walk around my blocks and focusing more on our 5-minute finds, which again are short videos where we highlight something cool that's happening outdoors, but not necessarily limited to our neighborhoods alone. So today we've got some exploring to do, so let's go ahead and head out. So I've stopped in this spot today here along the street in my neighborhood about 4 or 5 blocks from my house because there is some poison ivy growing here along the road. When I'm out walking with friends, family members, students, a lot of times the number one question I get is that plant poison ivy? And certainly there's a lot of fear surrounding poison ivy, and it's not without reason. Poison ivy produces a sap that contains a compound that can trigger an allergic response in up to 85% of people. So for a lot of people, coming into contact with poison ivy can result in having a really itchy, painful rash on our bodies that isn't so pleasant. But the number one thing we can do to prevent getting that rash and to deal with that fear surrounding poison ivy is to know what to look for. So today we're going to take a closer look at poison ivy and figure out what we need to be looking for so that we don't have to be so fearful every time we're out taking a walk in the woods or even just around our neighborhoods. So again, the trick to not being afraid of poison ivy when we're walking around our neighborhoods or we're out in the woods is to learn how to identify it. And it can be a little bit tough because poison ivy does look different at different times of year. In spring, when the leaves are first emerging, they can be reddish and sort of glossy looking. Now, as the summer months unfold, poison ivy has these dark green leaves like you're seeing here. Later in the fall, poison ivy will develop berries. And then in the wintertime, poison ivy doesn't have leaves at all, but all parts of the poison ivy plant, the roots, the vine, the leaves, the berries, have that oil or sap on them and in them, and so they can cause that allergic reaction that we talked about. So identification is really important. You've probably heard leaves of 3 let it be, which is definitely true with poison ivy to some extent, right? When we're talking about leaves of 3 like we're seeing here, these are actually what we call leaflets. So they're part of one entire leaf that joins the vine further down here. And you can look for a little bud where that leaf stem joins the rest of the plant, but chances are you probably don't want to be that close to poison ivy. So if you see 3 leaflets like this, there's a good chance you're seeing poison ivy. There are other plants that grow in a vine that have 5 leaflets. Virginia creeper is an example. But with poison ivy, you're always going to have those 3 leaflets that you're seeing here. The leaves on poison ivy are arranged alternately. So again, if we look down here where the whole leaf joins the rest of the plant, you can see that there's another leaf that joins the plant further down. So those leaves are going to sort of zigzag along the stem or the vine of the plant instead of being exactly opposite one another. There's a common tree in our area called box elder that has 3 leaflets like poison ivy does, and when it's really young can sometimes be confused with poison ivy. But box elder is going to have leaves that are opposite one another on its stem or twig, as opposed to being alternate one another. They're not going to zigzag. So poison ivy, those leaves are going to zigzag. And I'm going to Another thing that can make poison ivy difficult to identify is that it takes a lot of different forms. So the poison ivy that we're looking at here is growing as sort of a trailing vine across the ground. Other times poison ivy actually grows as a small shrub, so it can look a little bit like a bush. And then finally, poison ivy also can grow in a vine up trees, and then if the vine gets big enough, that vine can branch out, which is what we're seeing here. So on this tree, there's actually a couple of different vines going on. This is a type of bittersweet that we're seeing here with the lighter green leaves, and then the darker green leaves behind it are the poison ivy. Right? If you've got a vine like this growing up a tree and you're unsure if it's poison ivy or not, one thing to look for are fuzzy rootlets coming from the vine itself. And again, that's going to be hard to see just because my camera doesn't have the best quality here, but you're looking for a really fuzzy vine. If you've got a vine that's smooth, chances are it's probably not poison ivy, although really young poison ivy doesn't have too many rootlets. But if you've got a vine with thorns on it or a plant with thorns on it, you're looking at something like raspberry or blackberry. You're definitely not looking at poison ivy if it's got thorns, right? You might be wondering, knowing that poison ivy causes harm to people, right? Why we don't just remove it everywhere we find it. But poison ivy does have a lot of benefits. It is native to our area. You can find it up and down the East Coast, everywhere east of the Rockies, from all the way up in Canada, all the way down to Florida. And there are tons of different wildlife that depend on it. So lots of different bird species will eat the berries that develop at the end of the summer and typically last through the winter. All kinds of woodpeckers, warblers, vireos, and lots of wildlife eat the leaves. So deer, rabbits, even bear have been known to munch on poison ivy leaves. They don't have the same reactions in their bodies that humans do to poison ivy, to that oil or sap in poison ivy, and so they can utilize it just fine. So again, our best bet is just to learn how to identify poison ivy and recognize it where it is in our neighborhood so that we can learn to avoid it. Avoidance is the best trick, right, to not having that rash from poison ivy. All right, thanks everyone for joining me today, and hope to see you again in a few weeks for our final walk around my block.